When you think about climate, you probably think of things like hurricanes and droughts. But those are really better described as weather than climate. So what's the difference between weather and climate? And how do they affect organisms and ecosystems? I am so glad you asked that, guys. We're going to get ready to find out in this exciting new installment of Biology Notes, the climate version. So get your papers ready, wide right, skinny left, and I'll see you on the next slide. Many people use weather and climate interchangeably, but surprisingly, they're not. What, you say? Well, let me educate you a little bit. This is a weather map here from last year, about this time, Tuesday, November 13th. It shows the conditions on this day. We had a high pressure system with a cold front move across Texas, and there's a stationary front over in the eastern Rockies with a high pressure system on the other side of it also. I could pull up the current radar showing cloud cover. I can pull up a map showing current temperatures too. All of this is weather, the day-to-day conditions of Earth's atmosphere. One day it might be rainy and warm, the next clear and cool. This is weather. Climate, however, is the average conditions over long periods of time, say years. This map shows climates across the North American continent. Climates are usually characterized by two things, rainfall and temperature. Areas are cold, warm, or hot, and wet, dry, humid, or monsoonal. What's Houston's climate according to this map? Even though climate describes the conditions over large areas, environmental conditions can vary within an ecosystem, and we get something called a microclimate. One side of the valley, as you see in the picture here, may get direct sunlight, while the other side might be shaded. This usually goes unnoticed by us, but it's very important to the organisms that are growing there. In this picture you see ferns growing on one side of a valley, and ferns do not like direct sunlight, so that's pretty important. The main force that shapes our climate is solar energy. Many things happen to solar energy as it travels to Earth and strikes Earth's surface. Some of it is reflected back into space. Some is absorbed, and it's converted to heat. Some of that heat radiates back into space, and some is trapped in the biosphere. The balance between heat in the biosphere and heat lost back into space is what determines Earth's average temperature. This balance is controlled by a blanket of gases: carbon dioxide, methane, which is CH4, and water vapor. These are called the greenhouse gases. They act like a Snuggie. They act like a blanket. If the concentration of gases rise, the blanket's thicker and we're warmer. If the concentration of gases falls, the blanket's thinner and we're cooler. With no blanket at all, we would be about 30 degrees cooler than we are now, 30 degrees Celsius. This is called the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases controlling the rise and fall of temperatures because of their concentration. And you hear a lot about greenhouse gases in the news. Pay attention next time there's a news article about them. In class, we're either going to do or have just done a weather lab. In one part of it, you looked at the intensity of a light beam at different angles, and we see pictures here from last year's lab. Think about the results and conclusions. What we discover is the more direct the light beam is, the less area it seems to cover. The more indirect the light beam is, the greater the area it covers. The amount of light coming out of the flashlight was the same. So the intensity or strength of the light was less as the angle decreased. I can also see that illustrated in this diagram. The more indirect the rays are, the larger the area they cover, the weaker the solar energy is. So what does this mean for climate? I bet you're wondering that, and I'm really glad you asked that. Latitude. Latitude affects the intensity or strength of sunlight. The sun shines on us from the same direction all the time, but the curvature of the Earth means that sunlight hits the surface at different angles, just like you held the flashlight. So to recap that part of the experiment, latitude affects the intensity of the light, and the curvature of the Earth is what causes this. At the equator, we have very direct rays, and this produces very intense sunlight. This is called the tropical zone. At the polar regions, they receive the least direct rays. It's called the polar zone for obvious reasons, and the sunlight is not very intense at all. In between, we have something called the temperate zones, both the northern and the southern. These are in the middle between the polar and the equatorial or tropical zones. And as you might expect, things there are kind of in the middle. In the second experiment, you looked at hot water and cold water. Specifically, you looked at hot water immersed in cold water. And what you saw is what happens when the distribution of heat is unequal. Nature always tries to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium. That's its whole goal. And since hot things have more energy than cold things, it would make sense then that heat would rise, while the cold is being pushed down or sinks. You see that in the picture here on the left. The hot water started to rise. After about 20 minutes, the food color had spread through most of the beaker, but not quite all of it. You see that here in the picture on the right. If you look at the picture, what can you say about the temperature of the water all the way to the bottom of the beaker? Notice that it's kind of clear and the rest of it is blue. It's probably still a little bit cooler by a couple of degrees. So as the color spread, so did the heat energy. Heat rises, cold sinks, and nature tries to even everything out. So logic would tell you then that warm water is near the equator and cold water is near the poles. And it's this uneven distribution of heat that causes global winds and ocean currents. Warm water or air rises, expanding as it rises. And in doing so, it cools, losing heat energy to the surrounding matter. The cooling water or air starts to sink, getting pushed along by more warm water behind it, or air. This creates what we call a convection current. In this way, heat energy is moved around, both in air and water. You see the pattern of ocean currents here in this diagram. If you look closely, can you find the current that the turtles were riding on in the movie Finding Nemo? It was the Eastern Australian current, shown here by this red arrow. Is it a warm current or a cool current? What do you think? As we said, this uneven heating also creates wind currents, and we see wind currents in this diagram. Remember, water heats up more slowly and holds heat longer than land. Remember heat capacity from Unit 2? Yep, it's coming into play. Lower latitudes are closer to the equator and they have higher temperatures. Higher latitudes are closer to the poles, so they have lower average temperatures. They affect the winds. We see the pattern of winds around the globe here. These wind currents are just as important to weather and climate as the ocean currents. And here in Houston, it affects our hurricane seasons. Another way to see just how much these currents affect climate is to look at an example city on the globe. So if you wait just a second here comes a little red circle. There it is. It's circling Great Britain. We're going to talk about London. London is in Great Britain there, in England. It's in the red circle. Now if you look latitude-wise, it's up there by the southern tip of Greenland, and if you go all the way across to North America, it's by Nova Scotia. So it's actually very far north. But yet London's climate, its average yearly temperature, is warmer than you would expect for as far north as it is. Why do you think this is? I'll give you a clue. Look at the ocean current running along the coast of Great Britain. It looks like it's a warm current. These two diagrams are good to refer back to kind of show the relationships between atmospheric processes and the ecosystem processes and how they affect our climate models. In the left, that's kind of obvious, you can read those. And then if you look at the one on the right, it shows how there's a lot of connection between the ocean, the heat transport, air, water, all of that. They're just kind of good ones to refer back to when you're kind of stuck on things. So a quick little recap here about what we just talked about. The greenhouse effect, remember that Snuggie? The greenhouse effect is what keeps us just the right temperature to sustain life. Latitude, or the distance away from the equator, or the distance away from the poles, is what affects the intensity of our solar energy. There are three main climate zones here on Earth: the temperate, which is in the middle, the polars, which are up by the poles, and the tropical. There's only one of those. And those three zones are determined by latitude. Within those zones, there's an uneven distribution of heat that causes ocean currents and wind currents all around the globe. So there you have it, a quick little recap of what's going on in section 1. Don't forget your notes, don't forget your questions and your summary. See you in class.